and then I don't feel so bad.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and ask Dr. Austin and Maha to show their screens. And if we have our friends from Umoja as well, they can go ahead and show their screens too. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Stacy Ulrich. I'm the Director of Student Programs and Leadership in the College of Arts and Sciences at Boston University. This is our first ever virtual professor perspective, so we're very excited about that. I know that many of us are enduring some hard circumstances and, we'd much rather be all together. But this is a situation we have and we're working with it. And we're so glad you're able to join us, both the students and folks listening, as well as, of course, our speaker tonight and our students who are helping run this event tonight. So I wanted to give sort of some context for professor perspectives, do a little housekeeping, and then I'll turn it over. So Professor Perspectives is a lecture that we host about once a month for the whole BU community. We collaborate with a student organization and they bring in a faculty member who they want to hear from, and together everyone decides on kind of a topic that they want to hear about. So tonight we're co-sponsored with, hey Kelsey, Umoja, the Black Student Union, as well as the Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Activism. So we're very excited about that. So before I turn it over to Kelsey and then Maha, a couple of housekeeping things. Number one, as Dr. Austin reminded me, 50,000 people are without power tonight in Boston. So there is a small chance we will lose power in the middle of this broadcast, in which case our screens will go black and you won't see us because we need power to have internet. So if that happens, we're okay, but we'll just stop and you'll know why. Number two, there is a Q&A function on your screen that you should be able to see. When Dr. Austin's lecture is over, feel free to submit some Q&As and she will do her best to answer them and moderate a little discussion after she speaks. And then we have kept the chat open, so if you want to chat with folks as well, you can do that in the chat box. And I was curious, sort of who is represented here today. So I'm going to launch a little poll to ask you your BU affiliation. So are you a current student, an admitted student, or faculty and staff? Let's give you a couple seconds to fill out that poll. People are still kind of trickling in as our lecture is just beginning. All right, not everyone's voted, but I've seen that everyone who has voted is a current student. So good to know. Welcome everyone. Hope you are well and safe wherever you are. So I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey, who's representing Umoja, who's just going to talk a little bit about Umoja, and then she'll hand it off to Maha. Go ahead, Kelsey.
Sounds good. Hey, y'all. I'm Kelsey Russell. I'm currently a sophomore. I haven't done this in a minute. I'm currently a sophomore at Boston University in the College of Arts and Science, studying sociology and public health. And I am Umoja, Boston University's Black Student Union's co-event coordinator. I'm super excited to be here. Umoja is Boston University's Black Student Union, and Umoja comes from the Swahili word, which means unity. And the purpose of Umoja at Boston University is to unite students, faculty, staff, and alumni who identify as Black and also people who are interested in Black culture. And the way we do that is through events, social events, community outreach programming, and we also just serve as a simple student body leadership that is here to be adaptive and answer the questions of Boston University's Black student body and also anybody else who has any questions. We try to be an honest, trustworthy, confidential source of other things that are going on in your life at Boston University. And we're just really excited to be here, and I'm excited to represent us, especially because we're trying to find community in any type of way during this time. So it's super amazing that we're able to still talk about this ongoing conversation about race relations, even on Zoom webinar. So I'm super excited to be here and be representing Umoja.
Thanks so much, Kelsey. Really appreciate you. Maha.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maha Rafiq. I am the marketing coordinator for the Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Activism. We are the only fully student-run space and resource center on campus. When we get back to campus, you can find us in the basement of the GSU. As a resource center, we serve all students. We have a special focus on students from gender and sexual minorities who are traditionally underrepresented. We also host several clubs in our space that are focused on activism, diversity, and productive conversations of that nature, and you can find all about those clubs on our website. And I wanted to let people know about an event we're hosting this coming Thursday on the 16th. It's a Q&A with staff from the Office of the Dean of Students. So there's going to be Dean Elmore, Dean Badalino, other people from office that you might want to ask about. Any questions that you want to ask them, they'll be available for an hour or so to answer any questions that you have. So you can find information about that event on our Facebook and our Instagram. And there's a link to register that I will go ahead and send in the chat right now. That is on the 16th, and I believe it's at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And we're also going to be having a webinar at the end of this month regarding how it's possible to still engage in activism online and build community remotely during this time with one of our friends, Sasha Goodfriend from the Massachusetts chapter of the National Organization for Women. And we're going to be putting more information about that on our social media accounts shortly, so look out for that. And we'd love to see all of you guys at these events. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Professor Austin, who has graciously agreed to share some of her knowledge and engage with us in this dialogue today. Paula Austin is an assistant professor in history and African American studies. She is new to BU, having just joined the community last year. She previously taught at California State University, so I hope we can all welcome her with this virtual event. She's interested in, among other things, the history of racism, urban and women's history, the history of social science, and the history of childhood. Her book, Coming of Age in Jim Crow, DC, Navigating the Politics of Everyday Life, was published last year, and it's an examination into the lives of Black, poor, and working-class young people in the DC area during the 1930s. Her expertise and her interest in broadening the scope of what we consider to be intellectual history makes her the ideal person to lend some of her time to speak to us today about the history of Black women's organizing efforts. So, without further ado, I will go ahead and mute myself and turn my camera off and let Professor Austin take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I can't say I'm super happy to be here. I'd rather be doing this like in a room with people and not just like in my office by myself. I also have like the craziest setup in front of me to try to like read the notes that I've made to present and to also be able to like share my screen. So actually that's what I'm going to do, I think, so that I can show you some of the materials that I've put together for us to look at while I'm talking. Again, I want to thank the Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Activism and Student Programs and Leadership and Umoja for hosting this and for inviting me. And we started talking about this in February, I think. And the idea was to try to do something for, you know, what we call Women's History Month, which is problematic, as is Black History Month. We could come back to that in the Q&A if we need to. And I think, you know, and then initially, you know, we talked about this being focused on Black women and the movement for suffrage and maybe even kind of broadly sort of voting rights generally. And I think that, you know, in our new crisis moment, as we started to kind of rethink like what would this look like if we did it now, I thought it made sense to kind of talk more generally about wider organizing efforts that Black women have been involved in over the course of history, because there might be some lessons in there for us in our current moment. So I think as we were, when this all first started, I was watching a conversation on Democracy Now! That was, it included these two folks here that you see on the screen, Miriam Kaba on the left and Dean Spade on the right. And I don't know, folks might know who those people are. And if we were all in a room together, I'd ask for a show of hands for people, which I suppose we could do a virtual show of hands. Anyway, if you don't know who they are, so Miriam Kaba is an organizer, is an educator. She founded Project NIA, which is a grassroots organization working on ending youth incarceration. She was in Chicago for a long time, working with a bunch of different organizations, one in particular called We Charge Genocide. She co-organized the Just Practice Collaborative, which is a training and mentoring group that works with communities to create sort of sustainable practices to deal with harm and injury that happens around sexual assault in communities, and to try to put some community accountability practices in place that don't involve calling the cops. And currently she's a researcher in residence at Barnard Center for Research on Women's Social Justice Initiative. She also wrote a children's book, and that's what you see here underneath her image, about a young person whose father is incarcerated. And then Dean Smith is there. Dean Spade, sorry. Dean Smith, some of you might know who Dean Smith is. Dean Spade is a trans activist, a lawyer, associate professor of law at Seattle University School of Law, and author of a book that came out in 2015 called Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics and the Limits of Law. And Spade also founded and was staff attorney for an organization called the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which is a nonprofit law collective that provides free legal services for trans and gender nonconforming people who are also low income and or people of color. And actually, you'll see an image of Sylvia Rivera a little bit later. So anyway, I was watching them sort of talk about activism and sort of what it looks like in the contemporary moment. And they were really focused on mutual aid networks. And I think that maybe you've already seen a couple of links that kind of give you a sense of what mutual aid is, the organizations around mutual aid, what's happening across the country in our current moment. And really, so they were kind of talking about the hubs of information that are being created and the organizing that is like looking at kind of assessing community needs and then bringing people together to meet those needs. And they were insistent on talking about this work as solidarity work and not charity work. So you'll see that's what is on the slide right now, solidarity, not charity. And I thought it'd be that maybe what I could do tonight is highlight some work that includes mutual aid work by Black women over the course of the last, I don't know how much time I'm covering, 150 years or something like that, maybe a little bit less. So to do that, let me start with two organizing campaigns. The one is a group, two groups of Black laundresses in the American South in the 1880s and 1890s who formed sort of proto-unions and protective associations. And one of them was called, the one in Atlanta was called the Washington Society, the one in New Orleans was called the Ladies of Labor. And of course, in the post-Reconstruction American South, domestic work, laundry, maid services are sort of the work that Black women are being relegated to at this moment. This is also true in other places in the country, so not just the South. But the South is particularly important because the economy is this sort of post-war recovering economy. And so one of the things that these two protective associations did was to really fight for a standard rate, standard market rate for their services. And so I want to tell you a little bit about these two organizations. They both had democratic leadership structures in that folks were elected to leadership positions. There were membership dues that folks were paying. Both organizations engaged in letter writing campaigns, petitions, boycotts against local laundry facilities, who refused to honor the rate that they were calling for. They organized strikes and in some cases used intimidation to keep other women, both Black and white women, from crossing picket lines, intimidation and sometimes violence. They did canvassing and door knocking. They had counter demands in response to imposed city council licensing plans. They used social networks, social spaces, electoral politics, as they tried to get local government to represent their needs and interests. They organized rallies, marches, made public speeches, made threats against property, and sometimes actually damaged property, and they held mass meetings. And they ultimately were able, both the organizations were able to establish a standard rate of pay for their services and to hold local government, local businesses to that rate. And it's this work for Black women in post-Reconstruction South in particular, but I think in general, is important only partly because of the sort of prescribed gender roles that women and Black women in particular were being held to. And so the work that they were doing really blurred public and private, the public and private spheres of Black women's political activism. They built on all kinds of leadership skills that they were developing in other places, in religious organizations, in churches, political organizations, and through their community networks. And so it's important to think about what political activism and political engagement looks like, especially for people who are being kept from the polls. And we can talk more about that. Long history of voter suppression in Black communities. And so we can come back to that. The second campaign I want to share with you is Ida B. Wells's anti-lynching campaign. And so there is the cover of one of the publications that she makes, Southern Horrors. Her second publication, which was really about the reporting of a lot of the data that she was collecting, was called The Red Record. And you might know Wells. She was born in Mississippi just after the Civil War. She was an investigative journalist, an abolitionist, a feminist. She experiences the murder of one of her very dear friends, and she begins to investigate white mob violence after that. And she finds, as she begins to investigate these accusations of rape by Black men, that many of those accusations were really based in one, either consensual relationships that were happening or non-existent relationships that were happening between Black men and white women. And in the latter cases, where there was no relationship, she found that many of the men had refused employment by particular white employers, or they had a competing business in town. And so she reports out on all of this and called for, as a result of her reporting out of all of this, she gets kind of driven out of Memphis. Her printing press is burned and demolished, and she is driven out of Memphis. She goes to Chicago, but she continues to do this investigative work, and she calls for boycotts, for armed self-defense, for migration out of places where African Americans are experiencing racial violence and racial terror. She encouraged, most importantly, the growth of Black print media, basically saying that it was only African Americans who were going to report with accuracy around white mob violence and racial terror. And she was one, as I said, she was one of the, I don't know if I said this already, but she was one of the founders of the NAACP. And this is important because the early NAACP, and Megan Ming Francis wrote a great book about this, but the early NAACP actually focuses very seriously on a media campaign that is an anti-lynching campaign. And that really is Wells's influence on the organization. And of course, they eventually drop that and become the organization that we sort of know them to be, which is predominantly focused on legislation. You also can see here the one of the chapters of the National Association of Colored Women, which she also helped to co-found, and there were chapters nationwide. And I want to kind of go through a list of the issues that NACW was working on in the early 20th century, sort of to drive home a particular point about Black women's organizing. So here are some of the things that the NACW chapters nationally were working on. So they were organizing against racial violence and racial terror, so against lynching, against police brutality. They were calling for criminal justice reform. They called for Black teachers to be able to teach in Black schools, for jobs to be open to African Americans on railroads, for school buildings to be built in Black communities, for paved streets, for potable water, for sewer connections, for all kinds of like city infrastructure kinds of things. And of course, they also were organizing mutual aid societies, so food drives, clothing drives. They were fundraising to be able to support people who couldn't afford to bury their loved ones. And so this kind of multi-issue organizing platform is a really important one, because one of the things that's been happening this year is that there's been a lot of interest on trying to figure out what Black women's suffrage organizing looked like, right? This is the centennial commemoration of the 19th Amendment, which, as you know, removed sex and gender as criteria for voting. And so folks have been very interested in kind of trying to figure out what Black women's organizing around suffrage looked like. And one of the most important things to think about is that part of why we don't have a lot of archival documentation of sort of Black women suffragists is because most Black women's organizations and most African-American organizations generally in the early 20th century really were doing organizing work that was multi-issue. So we get an understanding of a kind of early theorizing and identifying of intersectional impact of racism, classism, and sexism. But however, Wells actually is one of the Black women who is a Black woman who starts one of the only single issue suffrage organizations in Chicago after she goes there after she's run out of Memphis, and that organization is called the Alpha Suffrage Club. And there's a good story of the Alpha Suffrage Club being sort of denied the ability to march in the 1913 march in DC. Anyway, okay. Let's go here. So if we move from what scholars call the New Negro movement, so the one that Wells and the National Association of Colored Women, NAACP, et cetera, are involved in, and we move to kind of the civil rights movement or the early civil rights movement, we could turn to Rosa Parks as an example of Black women's organizing. And of course, here is the iconic photo of Parks that we often use to think about the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And we could actually come back and talk about how that is actually not a photo of her sitting on the bus and refusing to leave in 1954. We'd come back to that iconic image, a little bit of a false image. But of course, we know the narrative around her role. You know, she's like this elderly person who is a seamstress. I think she was like 41 years old. She was actually a seamstress, but that she's tired this one day and refuses to get up, and then it begins the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and which is sort of thought to be or narrativized as the official beginning of the civil rights movement. But this narrative really misses a lot of significant things about Black women's organizing. And the first thing it misses is the long years, like I want to say almost a decade, of work that is happening through two organizations. One is the Women's Political Council and the other is the Montgomery Improvement Association. And you'll see on the slide the two women who were at the head of both those organizations, Joanne Robinson, and there is her mugshot, and Dr. Mary Fair Burks. And so those two women were really at the forefront of the work that leads to the Montgomery Bus Boycott that begins in 1954. And really they were engaged in activism around trying to get safe and equitable bus rides, to get increased routes in Black neighborhoods. So not specifically integration. I mean, that's one thing about the history of that particular protest movement, is that it wasn't focused on integration, but it actually does lead to the Supreme Court case that desegregates not only the Montgomery buses, but also public transportation nationally. And I can tell you a little bit about one of the sort of frequent practices that they were trying to get rid of, which was that the bus would drive up and, you'd get on to pay the bus, but you paid the bus at the front, and then you got off the bus and you had to get on the bus through the back entrance. And what happened way too many times was that someone would get on at the front, pay their fare, get off the bus to get on the back, and the bus driver would just drive off. So women who were most of the ridership were Black women who were moving around cities to get from their homes to domestic positions in white people's homes, were really the ones who were experiencing this. And they were also facing harassment on the actual bus. So sexual harassment, other kinds of violence, not just from bus drivers, but also from other riders, men and women, and from police, who often then were called to come on the bus and to like remove those women from the buses. So Robinson and Burks are really working on getting rid of this behavior, stopping this behavior, calling attention to this behavior for about a decade before 1954, when the bus boycott begins. Okay, but back to Parks for a moment. The other thing this narrative of Parks misses is that she's actually in Alabama about 10 years before she starts the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And so I want to tell you about Ricci Taylor, who you see there on the bottom right, sitting with her husband and her young one. And the Ricci Taylor story is a little harrowing if you don't know it, so I'm just going to warn you. But in September of 1944, Ricci Taylor, who was a mom, she was also a sharecropper, is on her way home from church. She is abducted. She is held for hours by 6 white men, and she is gang raped. And at the end of when she's finally released, she makes her way to her pastor's house and basically tells him what has happened to her. And what happened to her was not unusual in Alabama in the 1940s. The Alabama KKK kind of, had a sort of wave of terror that included sexual assault as well as lynching. But Taylor immediately tells her pastor contacts the NAACP, and they send out their investigator who has been traveling around the country and investigating mostly sexual assault of Black women. And that investigator is Rosa Parks. And Parks comes to Abbeville, Alabama in 1944, and she begins the investigation, and then she also starts a committee, and you'll see a document from that committee called the Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Ricci Taylor, which really fought to get those 6 white men indicted for that crime. I mean, Parks was already doing that investigative work. She was a member of the League of Women Voters. She was already a member of the NAACP and working for them to do this. So, and she was already investigating other sexual assaults. And so this kind of framing and understanding of why Parks goes to Alabama, the story of Ricci Taylor, and there's actually a really great film about it called The Rape of Ricci Taylor, and it uses the work of Danielle McGuire, who wrote a really important book that helps us think differently about the bus boycott as being one that really begins because it's focused on Black women's bodily integrity, demand for bodily integrity, both on public transportation, but also just publicly. So reframing what we know about Parks and how Parks gets to Alabama to do this work is an important one to help us understand the long organizing history and the level of engagement really that Parks has in the movement before we know her to be the tired old lady who gets up from her, who refuses to give up her seat. The third thing, and maybe really the fourth thing, I don't know, I've lost track count of how many things I'm trying to bring forward. But the other thing that we lose, and here is actually Parks' mugshot, but the other thing we lose is all of the other Black women who are arrested before Parks is arrested for the very same thing that Parks is arrested for. And so here you see Claudette Colvin, who was 15 when she was arrested in 1955. And Colvin actually was a youth activist with NAACP. And we also see Aurelia Browder. And Aurelia Browder was also arrested earlier than Parks. And it's actually Browder whose name is on the Supreme Court case that we get the determination in 1955 that desegregates the buses in Montgomery, but also nationally. But the other thing that we don't talk enough about is the way in which all of these women, the Women's Political Council, the Montgomery Improvement Association, were getting trained at a place called the Highlander Folk School. And on the left there, you see Septima Clark in the middle of that group of folks, some of whom are trainers and some of whom are folks who are at the Highlander School getting training to be labor activists, to be racial justice activists. And there is Clark in the middle. And Clark is actually Rosa Parks' mentor in the organizing work. And Clark played a really important role in both racial rights organizing and voting rights education. She developed literacy and citizenship workshops to help folks register to vote. And we can talk about what early voter suppression looked like in terms of literacy tests and exams to read and explain the Constitution. And she had had or before she gets to the Highlander School, she actually had another organizing career in South Carolina where she worked successfully to get Black teachers and Black principals in Charleston's public schools. The other example I want to bring forward is Pauli Murray, the example of Pauli Murray, who you'll see there on the right. And that is one of my favorite photographs of Pauli Murray. And then there is Pauli Murray at the bottom with Eleanor Roosevelt. And Murray writes a book that's published in 1950 called States, Laws on Race and Color, which really helped to lay the foundation for the theoretical framing and the use of the 14th Amendment in the Brown versus Board of Education case. Murray's activism, interestingly enough, begins in the 1940s. Probably it begins earlier than that in terms of her trying to get into school, but it begins in 1940s when she is on a bus going from New York to North Carolina with a friend. In Virginia, they're asked to move their seats. She refuses. They're both arrested. She's fined for and serves some jail time for disorderly conduct. She also worked on the first March on Washington, which was in 1941. It doesn't actually happen, but the threat of it pushes the federal government to open up World War II defense industry jobs to African Americans. Murray really deeply believed in the strength of the 13th and 14th Amendments, and we can talk more about what those are later, but it's that theorizing that she does that really influences Thurgood Marshall and the team of NAACP lawyers who work on the Brown versus Board of Education case. Okay, a couple more examples, and then I'm gonna stop talking. The Combahee River Collective, I'm sure that folks know who they are. There is an image on the top left with Barbara Smith. The Combahee River Collective, if you don't know, are kind of the folks who do some early theorizing about the thing that we now call intersectionality. And the collective was formed in 1974 by the two people you see on the top right, Barbara and Beverly Smith, and Demita Frazier. And they were New England members of another organization that was called the National Black Feminist Organization. And NBFO actually forms because there are many Black women who are sort of fed up with the misogyny of Black power organizations, not exclusively the Black Panther Party, but that is one of the organizations. And they form the National Black Feminist Organization. Of course, they come to the National Black Feminist Organization having done all of this work in the Black Panther Party, including work on electoral politics, on breakfast food programs, on food pantries, on health and sickle cell anemia clinics, etc. So NBFO begins to do these consciousness raising groups about sexual violence in Black communities and about media representation of Black women. And also they really take on the kind of continuation of economic justice programs. And on the lower right, you will see you'll see Johnny Tillman there on the left, who is also one of my favorite activists, and the National Welfare Rights Organization banner. And this is an image from the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. The National Welfare Rights Organization formed in 1966, which is the same year that the Black Panther Party formed. And there's a great, great article that where Tillman is interviewed. So if you haven't seen that, you should definitely Google Johnny Tillman. She's kind of amazing. But anyway, Frazier and the Smith sisters break off from NBFO to form the Combahee River Collective. And while the NBFO was very sort of centered in and engaged in Black feminism that focused on the kind of interrelated struggle of race, gender, and class equality, the Combahee River Collective organizers and founders really felt that NBFO was not so good at anti-homophobia. They were not so good as anti-capitalists. And so the Combahee River Collective actually, they bring with them the race, class, gender kind of theorizing and analytical frameworks, and they add an attack on homophobia and an attack on the destructive forces of capitalism into their mission and their activities. Okay, one final person, and then for real, I'm going to stop talking. That person is Joanne Walker, and I don't know if anybody knows who she is, but I wanted to introduce you to her in case you don't. Walker is an was an HIV/AIDS activist, and of course, HIV/AIDS reached epidemic proportions in between 1990 and 2000, and it remains an important health issue today. Walker was herself diagnosed in the late 1980s, and in 1992, she is incarcerated for a 4-year sentence for stealing a $200 coat. While she is inside, she begins organizing with other incarcerated women who were also HIV positive, and they form an organization called the Coalition to Support Women Prisoners with HIV and AIDS. Her work really helped to create a kind of to kind of bring forward a new issue around HIV/AIDS activism and prison reform, and specifically around health issues, which of course is something that we're seeing and trying to grapple with in our current pandemic. She worked, her work helped to win the compassionate release of someone who was inside and who was dying due to AIDS-related complications at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California. Walker herself died of AIDS-related complications, but she really built the beginnings of HIV/AIDS and prison reform activism around health issues. Okay, so let me end with this. And there are some amazing people on this slide: Shirley Chisholm on the top, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera there on the left, Fannie Lou Hamer and Sojourner Truth on the bottom, Kara Walker, and one of her kind of major artistic interventions below, Callie House there on the right, doing early reparations work, Angela Davis, and Bree Newsom, who I'm going to mention a little bit here in this closing statement. So the 21st century is rife with unabashed anti-Blackness, but Black women have emerged as some of the most formidable opponents. Maxine Waters reclaiming her time. There's Bree Newsom scaling a flagpole to tear down the Confederate flag at the South Carolina State House grounds. Angela Whitehead, who threw 2 white police officers out of her house, out of her Wisconsin house after they entered illegally. Stacey Abrams, of course, and her fight against voter suppression in her state, in Georgia. And other Black women activists who are athletes, artists of all kinds, and so many more unsung and everyday Black women who have been at the front lines, in the back rooms of social movements. And of course, we can't forget Occupy, or the founders of Black Lives Matter, who are 3 Black women. This history of activism around racial, economic, gender, and sexuality justice tells us a lot about the kinds of structural inequities and inequalities that make up our society, that are embedded foundationally. And these activists, through their work and through their critique of conditions and inadequate and neglectful government responses, show us how to build new social relationships and show us how to imagine new worlds. And I will stop there. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Austin. That was amazing, really appreciate it. So I'm gonna go ahead and open it up to questions right now, but first I want to acknowledge that our opening poll was not inclusive, and that was definitely my fault. I did not ask who were alums, and I've already heard from a few of you, so welcome, strong welcome to our alumni community. In fact, I was thinking, since the chat is open to everyone, if you wanted to introduce yourself, alums or current students or admitted students, especially those of you who are working with organizations related to the lecture, that would be great. I mean, it's a good moment to form community. So we're opening it up to questions now. You can ask questions via the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand. I believe I can give you the option to speak. Any of our panelists, Kelsey or Maha, Delise, I saw that you joined us. You're also welcome to chime in with questions. But I will open it up now. So please ask Dr. Austin or each other your questions. I know, Dr. Austin, you had asked me to share a link, which I will share with everyone now. Will you
Okay,
talk a little bit about what this is? It's the Big Door Brigade. I just shared it there. If you want to follow it, you have to do services and then open URL on your end, listeners. But do you want to talk a little bit about what that is, Dr.
Sure.
Austin?
So I talked about Dean Spade. I'll go back to that slide so we remember solidarity, not charity. And one of the things, well, a couple of things that Dean Spade and Miriam Kaba talked about in that interview that they did on Democracy Now! Was this kind of a hub so that you could figure out where you might find some mutual aid that you could either be involved in or to figure out how to, okay, so there are two things. One is that there's a hub for sort of mutual aid societies that are organizing right now. But then the other thing is kind of like, how do you do that? How, you know, what if there isn't something in your community and you want to start something in your community? The Big Door Brigade is actually a great resource. It talks about what mutual aid is. And then it also gives you some skills and strategies for how you can put one together with the other folks in your community. And there's a great little video that specifically looks at sort of prison intervention, mutual aid societies that you could put together.
Great, thank you very much. Let's see, I just got a question I see from Lynn Goodman. She's an alum from BU Law 88. Thanks for the wonderful historical overview. What mistakes are being made now by social justice advocates that history teaches us were mistakes?
This is a good one. Okay, so I will just make a historian's disclaimer, although I feel like there's some historians who don't make this disclaimer, who just like go right in. I'm one of those historians who wants to make this disclaimer. So I think there are many of us in the field of history who don't feel comfortable commenting on the contemporary moment. But I think one of the mistakes that we make contemporarily when we look at social movements that we're sort of inside of is thinking about what is success and what is failure. And I think one of the things we learn when we look at historical movements and sort of historical actors is that, and we look at them closely and kind of not with a frame of success or failure, is that we actually see very messy processes, lots of internal debate and disagreement, and also really multiple strategies and multiple kind of ideologies across organizations in some case. I mean, I talked about how the Smith sisters and Demita Frazier break off from MBFO. I mean, that happens all the time, that organizations are formed, people stay in them, but also start other things. So there's so many multiple things going on at the same time, and we often don't learn the history of social movements in that way. So when we're in our contemporary moment and we're like, oh shit, this is a mess, like this is terrible, it's gonna fail, it might actually not. Actually, when we look back at the messiness, it turns out the success of social movements actually take a lot of things to be happening simultaneously. So I always say, like, there's a role for you. Figure out what you do, figure out what the organizations look like, and then figure out where you fit in, because actually it's going to take everybody doing almost literally everything that's possible to do to make a successful movement, because that's the thing we don't know when we look back at movements in the ways that we have looked back at movements, right? We've been very narrow about how we've looked at those.
Thank you. Sort of related to that, we got another question. Where do you see the Black Lives Matter movement in this history of organizing? Was it not started by mostly Black women? Yeah, 3 Black women who I think all identify as queer started the Black Lives Matter movement. And and they do talk, the 3 of them really talk about the importance of those identities in the coming together. And I think if we look at the Movement for Black Lives mission statement and the vision statement, which I use every semester in my teaching, we see this very expansive and egalitarian sort of calls. We saw those calls in the late 60s for a lot of organizations, the American Indian movement, right? These calls that are inclusive of all human rights, essentially. And
and when we look at the vision statement for the Movement for Black Lives, we see those calls even more expansive than they were in the late 60s and early 70s.
Great, thank you very much. I don't see any other questions coming in right now, so please get those questions in if you have any, folks. We'll give you another couple minutes.
Or even comments.
Yes, we got a "that's so encouraging" about the messy movements.
Yeah.
Still being helpful. We have another alum from the College of Engineering class of 1986 who's currently organizing on a political campaign of a young Black woman running for NYC Council. So very cool. She commented that the Me Too movement was started by a Black woman, Tarana Burke.
Tarana Burke, that's right. Yes. Why did I not include Tarana Burke as one of the people on my list? Yeah, I apologize for that. But yes.
Good question with a MLK quote. In your opinion, do you see the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice?
This is a good question. Thank you for that. This is tough. So I don't want to be a pessimist here, but of course, the minute I said that, you know where I was going. I think the trouble with that quote from King is that I don't know that we have evidence of that in our history. I think that has been the narrative, right? We would like for that to be the arc. And I think it's why activists keep working, right? Because we insist on making the critiques, talking about what's missing, and then trying to build that world based on the idealism of, sort of what the US has said it was going to be. But I think internationally, this is also true, right? Sort of justice movements being based on human needs and what is just. So, but I don't know that it necessarily bends. I mean, I think I think it's the work that we do to make it bend. And, maybe that's what he meant. He certainly did not think we were going to get there without organizing. And the year before he dies, he starts the Poor People's Campaign. He realizes that economic justice needed to really be upfront. And, we already had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but yet there were all of these urban communities who were sort of bringing the issues around poverty and housing insecurity and food insecurity and job discrimination to the kind of forefront of issues. So, yeah, I think he probably meant that we need to make it bend. And so I think that's what activists are doing, insisting on it.
Great, thank you. We get another one from Karen Wharton. Do you believe that there is merit to Black women separating and organizing among themselves? Is that model more successful based on history?
I think the history that I know about is that while that may have been happening, and that was happening, right? There were some organizations that identified themselves as separatists, including pretty radical white lesbian organizations in the late 60s and early 70s who absolutely identified themselves as separatists. What we don't always talk about is the coalition building and the kind of cross support that we see in those movements. So you could organize around specific issues to the community that you were in. And then you could also show up for other people. And I want to just, let's see if I can get to that slide so the slide that shows Johnny Tillman in the march for the Poor People's Campaign also shows all of these other people who showed up to march with the National Welfare Rights Organization, right? Including the Native American man, the white woman who looks like, she probably was a member of the National Organization of Women. So yes, that happened, that people did kind of, remove themselves from kind of maybe more diverse organization to form something where they were looking at specific issues, but people really showed up and built coalitions. I mean, the Black Panther Party, was working with Appalachian workers and helping them to organize. They were working with the Young Lords Party. They were working with a predominantly white middle-class Students for a Democratic Society and their anti-war stuff. So that kind of cross support was happening throughout those early movements. And I think that's happening still.
Absolutely. Another question from Alyssa. How can you, sorry, I just lost it. How can you imagine public discourse, mainstream media, or textbooks, for example, could better reflect the messiness of social movements, and what might the impact of that be?
Hi, Allie. Thanks for coming. Yeah, I mean, that'd be great. I'd sort of, yeah, it'd be really wonderful. I mean, I think some of the trouble, and I think this is, like historians talk about this, and I don't know what the textbook industry looks like. I just know that much of it is not accurate. But I think some of the struggles that I know about from historians who are trying to work on some of those textbooks is how to deal with nuance and the messiness, right? So like how to kind of hold all of those different things together simultaneously. I think one of the best ways I find to do that in the classroom, so not with a textbook, is actually through primary sources. So I mix students who've taken my classes, both at Sac State and here at BU, can tell you, like, we have like 12 primary sources a week that we're looking at, and they're like from everybody. So let's look at what everybody is saying, in 1935. And that's where you get some of that, like, competing discourses, different people doing different things, a bunch of different strategies and philosophies, and you can get to some of that messiness. I don't know what that would look like on a textbook, but I think in terms of impact, it would let people know, like, that a successful movement takes everything you could possibly think of to do.
Great. We've got two more questions here. So one of them is about religion. Was religion always a prominent part of 20th century Black women organizers? If so, do you think that's changed over time? And to what extent have churches played a role in this?
So, I mean, I think some of the understanding that we have about the role of churches comes from the early 20th century, and then certainly the kind of the traditional civil rights movement. But the role, I think, I'm not sure that the religiosity is the important part of thinking about the role of churches in any movement. I think it's about the social space and the sort of the social network. And I think that continues to be true, and it might look different. It might be a religious organization, but it might not. So I think what churches did was, it was this place that people in communities came together, right? Lecturers came in to give talks, and they weren't always religious, right? In many cases, they were sort of political education folks who were coming in to talk about racial justice or economic justice. So I think it's about the role that the space of the church and that the space of religious organizations play, especially for people who may not have political power, right? Whose votes are being suppressed, or they're not even able to, they don't even have voting rights. Those spaces, those social space and community spaces, religious or otherwise, really serve an important place for people to come together, to get support, to share stories, and to get some political education and some organizing skills. And what we know about about early movements is that women who were in those spaces were getting a lot of leadership training that they then go out and use in kind of more traditional political ways.
Great. Our final question from Jamila Mannings from Question Class of 96 says, great presentation, thank you. Where do you see the next emerging call to action for women and minority women of color? There is still such disparity in pay and wealth equity. Are there organizations that I can join that are in existence today to help champion these causes? And I will make a call for folks listening. Feel free to type your organizations and your ideas in the chat box as well, so you can share those with each other. But Dr. Austin, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I could speak to, like, I'm probably not best suited to speak to sort of emerging. I mean, I think you said it yourself, which is the ones around economic justice. I mean, I think that is what is becoming, and probably health equity, right? Those are becoming so clear in our current moment. And the question is, what kind of structural changes are we going to make based on those? And so I think looking at the link that kind of has the hubs of organizations locally is a great place to start to kind of figure out how to get involved, to kind of see what's happening locally around those issues. There are certainly national organizations. I mean, the one that I think of that includes economic justice and health equity is the Movement for Black Lives, and they often have links to what local communities are doing, which is different than Black Lives Matter. It's the Movement for Black Lives website. I can try to, I don't know, I'm not sure I can try to get it and send it, but they are disseminating information about what local organizations are doing. Movement for Black Lives is really a hub for not just Black Lives Matter across the country, but a bunch of other organizations that are doing similar work.
Trying to find the link for you there.
Okay.
I wanted to give an opportunity to any of our students who are representing organizations to do any final promotions for other events coming up, or any final thoughts from Umoja or the CGSA. Give them a second. And if not, Dr. Austin, do you know what classes you're teaching this fall? Because I imagine there's folks listening that definitely want to take your class.
Are we having classes this fall?
I hope so.
I'm really stressed out about this.
Let's not go down that road yet.
Okay. I am teaching an Introduction to Black Studies and an African American History course, which essentially starts in the late 1500s and comes to the contemporary moment.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sure you'll get lots of these folks in your class in the fall, assuming we are here in the fall, which I hope we are. But thank you so much, Dr. Austin. Thank you, students. Thank you all of our alum that tuned in tonight, as well as our current and admitted students. Please stay safe, take care of yourselves, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.